Hello again and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to share a workshop which I presented a couple of days ago to a group of students. The workshop covers the TOEFL independent essay. Now, before I get started, I will back it up a little bit and talk about the TOEFL writing section in general. There's a few things you should know. The TOEFL writing section is the last part of the TOEFL test. It consists of 2 questions which have equal value. It takes about an hour to complete this section of the test, which includes 50 minutes overall of actual writing time, and it counts for 25% of your overall score. As I said, there are 2 questions in this part of the test. First up is the integrated writing task, and that's actually the one I'm not going to talk about today, but hopefully in a few weeks I'll have a workshop about that as well. The integrated writing task consists of reading, listening, and writing. In this task, the student reads a short academic article and listens to a related lecture. The student then writes an essay using information from both, and they can see the article as they write it. They have 20 minutes of total writing time. After that is the independent writing task, which is what this presentation is going to be about. In this task, the student responds to a short question and then writes an essay based on their personal experience or opinion. They have 30 total minutes of writing time. That includes preparing, writing, and revising. The directions given note that an effective essay will contain a minimum of 300 words. And I really want to draw your attention to that word minimum. You can certainly write more than that if you want. And indeed, I generally recommend writing a bit more than 300 words. Now, what does the independent writing question actually look like? Well, when you take the TOEFL, you're probably going to get a question that looks like one of these 3 styles that are on the screen now. At the top, you can see what we call the agree-disagree style. And when I did a survey of about 500 students like a year and a half ago, almost half of them told me they got some sort of agree-disagree style question. You can see it on the screen there. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The best way for students to study for tests is to work in groups. Basically, most of the time you just get a short statement, a single sentence, and you're asked whether you agree or disagree with it, and then you're writing an essay about your agreement or your disagreement. Also quite common is the second one on the screen here, which is the preference style. In this case, the student is asked to choose between 2 similar options. They're similar, but generally opposing. So for example, the question says some people think the internet has made life easier and more convenient. Other people say that the internet has made life more complex and stressful. What is your opinion? So basically you take a side, you state your opinion, and then you write an essay all about it. In the survey I did, the students indicated they got this style of question about 25% of the time. And then the other 25% got the style on the bottom of the screen here, the multiple choice style, where you're given 3 or 4 options and you're asked to pick one. For example, the question says, what do you think is the best way for the government of your country to improve the lives of people in the town where you live? Build more public transportation, build more schools, or build more parks. Pick one, write an essay about it. And I can't make any guarantees, but probably on test day, you're going to get a question that looks like one of these. Now, there is one kind of wrinkle that I will mention, and that is that, in the last few years, students have noticed fairly long questions. They're the same 3 styles that I showed you a moment ago, but they tend to be longer and maybe a little more complicated to understand. For example, look at the one on the bottom of the screen here. It's the same question about the internet, right? But it begins with a couple of background sentences that introduce the concept. So it says, the internet can be accessed by people all over the world nowadays. It has had an impact on many different aspects of our lives. And then you get the question. So it's the same thing, right? Those first 2 sentences, they're not particularly useful for your essay. You're going to write the same essay as if you got the short version. It's just, I don't know, it's just different. It's new. It's maybe a bit more realistic. Now, I mention this now only because some students get a little bit nervous when they see one of these long questions. They kind of get panicked because they're not prepared for it. The prep materials they've been using have not included such long questions. So they think they're getting something new or unexpected. But in fact, it's the same. It's the same kind of thing. The essay they write is going to be the same, and there's no reason to be nervous. So I mention this now just in case you get a long question on test day, that you don't panic or you don't think you're getting something unexpected. Now, the questions themselves, I mean, they could be about any topic in the world. There's no guarantees. However, based on my experience, the questions seem to be about one of these three subject areas that you see on the screen now. And at the top is the most common, education. A lot of the time, the independent writing question relates to education. When I did that survey, again, about half of the people said they got something related to education. So, for example, that could be a question about whether it's better to work in groups or to work alone, like I showed you. Or it could be a multiple choice question where you pick the best characteristic for a teacher to have. Likewise, many of the questions often relate to work. So, for example, you could get a question about the best characteristic for a boss or supervisor to have, or a question about the best way to resolve a disagreement with a coworker. Again, that's a very common subject for the TOEFL independent writing section. Now, the last subject here, it's a bit of a cop-out, I agree. Society, it's very broad, but that includes questions like the impact of the internet, or maybe a question about, how to improve the town where you live, as I showed you a moment ago, something like that. So what this means is that as you prepare for the independent writing question and you're writing practice essays, try to get questions that kind of match these three subject areas, and I think that will make your preparation a lot more efficient and effective. And, a common technique to practice writing skills is to keep a daily journal or a daily diary. And as you're writing about your life, maybe try to focus in on stuff related to education and work. And again, that'll give you some ideas and examples that might come in useful when you're taking the actual test. You want to make sure your practice is as useful and appropriate as possible. All right, so that's an introduction to what the question actually is. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about a few things. First of all, how to approach the task. Next, I'll talk about how to include the right language and the right grammar. And finally, I'll talk about what matters and what doesn't in this part of the test. First up, approaching the task. What do essays need? How to come up with ideas. In terms of what an independent essay needs, it's not very complicated. It's the same kind of essay you've been learning about for years. Your essay should include an introduction, some body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And within those sections, there are a few things I recommend. For the introduction, make sure you include some background information that introduces the general topic and theme of the essay. And yes, I'm going to show you an example in just a moment. After you've included that background information, you should include a clear thesis statement, which states your direct response to the question you've been asked. So it could be something like, I believe that it's best to work in groups, or I believe it's best to work alone, something like that. After your introduction, you've got the body paragraphs. 2 or 3 body paragraphs is generally enough. Some people like to write 4, and that's fine too. Each body paragraph should include a main idea, that is a reason for your thesis. And following that main idea, you should include supporting details and examples. And you do the same thing in all of the body paragraphs. At the end of your essay, it's the conclusion where you repeat the thesis and you repeat the main ideas. And here you're going to try to paraphrase a little bit. Don't use the exact same words when you repeat your thesis. Change it up a little bit to show off your mastery of the English language and vocabulary. So I'll give you a sample essay, and it's going to respond to one of the questions I showed you a moment ago. Agree or disagree that the best way for students to study for tests is to work in groups. And here's what I came up with. I start with an introduction. It includes some background information. In this case, I wrote, everyone has their own favorite study methods, and all of them have specific benefits. What matters most is that students achieve long-term academic success. So you can see I've got a couple of sentences here. I think that's a good idea. And my essay is about study methods. It's about academic success, and it's about students. And so I've mentioned those three things in the background information. I haven't stated my opinion yet. I'm just introducing the topics of discussion. Now, some people think that they should repeat the question here in the background information. Personally, I don't think that's a good idea because you want to use new words. You don't want to just repeat stuff from the question, and this method allows for a greater variety of vocabulary to be used. In any case, after the background information is my thesis statement. I am of the opinion that it is better to study alone than to study in a group. I clearly answered the question. And I signaled that this is a thesis statement by using the phrase, I am of the opinion that. You could use any kind of signal, like I believe that, personally I feel that, something like that. It's not mandatory, but a kind of a signal like that lets the reader know that, yeah, this is my thesis right here. Don't miss it. After that, I've got my first body paragraph, and I start with a main idea where I support my thesis. First of all, studying alone helps us to focus on specific ideas that we are struggling with. It's pretty straightforward, and it begins with another signal, first of all, and that lets the reader know that, yeah, this is my first body paragraph. This is my first main idea. I won't read it all here, but after that, I've got some supporting details and examples. I basically began with a few details that explain what I mean, and then I jumped into a personal example, which I followed through all the way to the end of the paragraph. I did the same thing in the second body paragraph. Furthermore, and then I have my second main idea. Again, furthermore is my signal that this is my main idea. And then I've got the same thing. I've got one sentence here that has some details, and then most of the body paragraph is a personal example about working in a group. The last part of the essay is my conclusion. I've got a thesis, which begins with in conclusion, signal that clearly this is my conclusion, and then I repeat my thesis using slightly different words. And then I repeat my main ideas. Now take a look at how I stated the second main idea. Here in the body paragraph, I said when people study in a group, they are easily distracted. But then when I repeated it in the conclusion, I changed it up. I said it helps us to avoid socializing when we should be doing real academic work. Again, it's basically the same idea, but I'm using completely different words. Indeed, I'm using words probably that don't always even appear in the body paragraph. So I'm showing off my vocabulary by avoiding repetition. Remember that you're being judged on your ability to use English grammar and vocabulary. You're not being judged on your ability to use the copy and paste function of your computer. So resist the urge to use copy and paste, even though that tool is available during the test. In terms of word count, I think this one's probably about 390 words. Again, that's more than the minimum, but just slightly more. That's about what I recommend for most students taking the test. 380, 390, maybe 400 in certain cases. Not much more than that. Okay, so that almost makes coming up with an essay seem easier than it actually is, right? But it's not. It's not easy to write a TOEFL essay. It's actually quite challenging for most people. And one of the most common complaints I get once I've, shown this structural thing is, yeah, I can do that, but I can't come up with any ideas. Like, I work with a lot of young people and they say, hey, I don't have a lot of life experiences. I'm just a kid. I spend most of my time at home playing video games and looking at social media, right? Like, I don't have any ideas. How can I approach these tasks? Well, in that case, I show them a chart like this, and I'll usually get them to make this chart themselves on paper. And it says work, health, learning, and friends. And the approach is to think about the question in terms of these 4 quadrants. So it's easy for the student to say the internet is beneficial. That they can come up with. But in terms of supporting reasons, I'll tell them, okay, so think about how the internet helps us in terms of work. Next, think about how the internet helps us in terms of health. And then learning, and then friends. And if they narrow their focus to these 4 specific ideas, they can kind of forget about all the junk that's kind of jumbling around in their heads, and it's a lot easier to focus on coming up with ideas. It gives them a head start and gives them some clues. So for example, if the student has said that it helps us with that it's beneficial, it's easy to say, okay, so in terms of work, the internet makes it easier to work from home. And then this kind of becomes their first main idea, and then the focus of their whole first body paragraph. And then if they're thinking about it in terms of health, it's easy for them to say, okay, the internet makes it possible to talk to medical specialists even if we live in a rural area. And that becomes like the second main idea, and that becomes the whole focus of the second body paragraph. But if they're thinking about learning, they can say, well, with the internet, people all over the world can study advanced subjects. Now they've even got a third body paragraph if they want it. Or, they can just stop after coming up with 2 and just write the essay. But of course, if they're talking about friends, they could say something like, using the internet, we can keep in touch with our friends, even if we move abroad. Again, now they've got 4 ideas they can work with. After they've come up with these 4, they can just pick and choose like the 2 or 3 that they think are best, and then ignore the other 1 or 2. So this approach tends to work with most of the independent questions I see. Again, I can't give you any guarantees. You might get something weird and esoteric that cannot be fitting into these 4 quadrants, but I've never really seen anything like that. The technique seems to work. But, let's take a look at the same chart for the question about working in groups or working alone. Perhaps the student says, yeah, it's better to work in groups. Well, why? Well, if you're thinking about work, you could say working in groups teaches us how to collaborate, which is useful in our future careers. And there you've got a whole body paragraph you can write. Or if you're thinking about learning, you could say studying in a group helps us to learn things from our classmates. You've got another body paragraph. Or in terms of friends, you might say, when we study with peers, we can form friendships that will last for our whole life. Now, I could not come up with anything related to health. Like, I tried, but in terms of groups, it doesn't seem to relate to that. However, that's okay, because now I've got 3 ideas. I can maybe pick the best 2 and then write my essay. And, you've got 30 minutes, and so I generally recommend 2 or 3 minutes for planning. With practice and with repetition, the student can fill out this chart usually pretty quickly. And then they've got some ideas, and then they get rolling on writing the actual essay. Okay, so that's how to approach the essay. So now you know what needs to go into it, how to come up with ideas. And finally, let's talk a little bit about language and grammar. Like this is a test of your ability to use the English language and to write in English. So obviously language use and grammar are very, very important. So we'll talk about what's necessary and what the scoring rubrics mean. Actually, let's get right to the scoring rubrics. The rubrics are these charts. You've probably seen them as you've prepared for the test. These are what ETS gives to the human raters. And it's their guide to giving your essay a score. They give your essay a score from 0 to 5. And that's it. So I'm going to show you the top 3 levels on the screen now. Let's focus, of course, on a score of 5. Like what constitutes a perfect essay? Most of this is pretty easy to understand, right? Effectively addresses the topic and task. Yeah, okay, so I get that. The essay needs to be on topic. It needs to actually address the question that has been asked. It needs to be well organized and well developed with explanations and details. Like, okay, I get that too, yeah? It needs to be basically an essay with a thesis and background information. It needs main ideas, it needs reasons, it needs details, and maybe examples. I notice it uses exemplifications and or details. So you could use details or you could use examples. Both are fine. Displays unity, progression, and coherence. That's a little bit more difficult to understand, but basically they're looking for an essay that kind of sticks with an argument and carries through with the argument and kind of remains focused. Now the last part, that is where both students and teachers really struggle to understand what this means. It says that a level 5 essay, a perfect essay, displays consistent facility in the use of language, demonstrating syntactic variety, appropriate word choice, and idiomaticity, though it may have minor lexical or grammatical errors. Now that gets a big what the heck from a lot of people, including teachers, including myself when I first saw this. Like, I know what a grammatical error is, okay? I know what that means and I know how to avoid those. A lexical error, yeah, that one I did look up, but it really just means like word choice errors, using the right word. Even in grammatically correct contexts, a lexical error is just a word choice error. Okay, fine. But syntactic variety, when you Google that, you really just get references to the TOEFL test, so it's not particularly useful or easy to understand. And idiomaticity, that leads to a lot of confusion. So we're going to talk about what it means to achieve syntactic variety and idiomaticity now. Syntactic variety. In terms of the TOEFL, there's a few things you need to know. You should know that your essay should contain a variety of sentence types. So I don't want to turn this into a grammar lesson right now, but basically you should ensure that your essay contains simple sentences like, Simon took the math test. He was totally unprepared for it. You should also make sure your essay contains compound sentences like, Simon took the math test, but he was totally unprepared for it. So you're using coordinating conjunctions like but, so, and, for, nor. You can look them up. You also want to make sure your essay contains complex sentences, like even though Simon took the math test, he was totally unprepared for it. So you need subordinating conjunctions like even though, while, and when. Again, I think these concepts should not be totally new to you, but if you're unfamiliar with the terms, make sure you look up simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences. Using a variety of those will ensure that you've got some degree of syntactic variety. Sometimes a student will give me an essay and ask me to grade it, and the grammar is perfect. There's no mistakes. However, it only contains simple sentences. So I can't say this is a level 5 perfect essay because it doesn't have syntactic variety. Or maybe it has like 19 simple sentences and then one compound sentence. Still, it doesn't have syntactic variety. It needs a greater variety of sentence types. So if we look at the essay I wrote, and I showed you a moment ago, you can see where I've used some conjunctions. I used and to create a compound sentence in my introduction. I used so and but to create a few compound sentences here as well. I used when and I used as to create complex sentences. So there's not a ton of them. There might even be a few more, but like the whole essay is only, 23 sentences maybe. So you're just kind of salting your essay with a few of these different sentence types. 4 or 5 maybe should be enough. I've got a few more in the second body paragraph. I used or to create a compound sentence. I used when and while to create complex sentences. So that's basically what you need to know in terms of achieving syntactic variety. What about idiomaticity? This is one of the most misunderstood terms in the rubrics. Contrary to what some people believe, idiomaticity does not refer to the use of idioms. The student need not write that he was over the moon after passing his test, or that he was as happy as Larry after getting a new job. Instead, you must remember that idiomaticity is, and I'm quoting just a dictionary here, the extent to which a learner's language resembles that of a native speaker. So what do I mean? Well, here's a few sentences from an essay I checked for a student a couple weeks ago. Here at the top. Business owners want employees to make quick decisions, which renders stress for those who prefer to take their time. I understand the meaning completely. I know what it means. And the grammar is fine too. However, the use of renders, to me as a native speaker, it sounds awkward and strange. Like I think a better verb would be causes or creates. That's what I would use. And then the sentence wouldn't sound strange or weird. So that's an issue of idiomaticity. And the next one, when the shopping mall opened, many local shops ceased their business. Again, I know what it means and the grammar's fine, but a more natural expression would be went out of business. And there's one more, and this is like in a thesis statement. I strongly think that children should attend all of their classes. I often see strongly think, and that's almost good enough, and a lot of teachers would just ignore it, but it does sound a little bit awkward and weird. So what I want to hear is strongly believe. And so this is what it means by idiomaticity. This can be hard to improve, right? Like you kind of need feedback. So if you want to improve in this area of your writing, I do encourage you to have your essays checked by someone who's very strong in the English language, maybe a native speaker, or maybe not, maybe just someone who really knows their stuff, and ask them to look for awkward and strange word choices. Ask them to highlight those. Those are the kind of things that a lot of teachers will sometimes ignore because they feel, it's good enough. I know what you mean, the grammar's fine, there's no problem. However, if you want to improve your idiomaticity, this is the sort of thing you need to do. You want to get feedback on your writing and you want to learn more natural word choices. All right, now I did mention the grammar is straightforward, but it matters. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. There's a few things you can do to reduce your grammar error rate. Now, grammar can be a little bit controversial, right? Like if you ask the people from ETS, they will tell you, hey, yeah, this is meant to be a first draft essay, so you can make some grammar mistakes, it's okay. And that's true, right? Like you can still get a perfect score with a few grammar mistakes. But, at the end of the day, if you have more grammar mistakes, your score will go down. So your ultimate goal should be to write essays with grammar that is as perfect as possible. You want to eliminate as many mistakes as you can in your writing. So I will draw attention to a few tools you can use online to get some grammar help. The most prominent, which most people probably know, is Grammarly. It's a really great website where you can upload your writing and get immediate feedback on a variety of grammar and language use issues. Just today, I uploaded a paragraph from a student essay, and immediately you can see I got a ton of feedback on a variety of things like subject-verb agreement, prepositions, articles, pronouns, prepositions again. So it covers like a whole bunch of different mistakes. Now, it's not perfect, right? Because it's a website, not a human. But if you upload your essays to this service, you will probably learn a lot about the types of mistakes you're making and how to eliminate quite a few of them. There's paid options, there's free options. For most people, I think the free option is enough, but the paid option is, I guess it's even better. So that is something I strongly recommend that you check out. There's also another service which is similar but new. It's from Edagree.com. Edagree is a website or service which helps link students to colleges and universities in the United States. And so they have a whole suite of tools and features and options for students. One of them is their English writing practice tool. And if you create an account, you should easily find it. It functions somewhat like Grammarly, where you can upload a piece of writing and get immediate feedback on it. So I uploaded the same paragraph, and you can see I got a handful of grammar corrections, like I did with Grammarly. Now, it's not the same corrections, so you can even use like both tools to check the same writing. And with Edagree, I also get some feedback on the organization, the style, and the mechanics, in addition to grammar and usage. And the fun thing about this is that the Edagree tool is built using the same AI technology that ETS uses to grade the actual TOEFL. Now, you're not going to get like a TOEFL score for your writing here. It's not set up on Edagree to be a TOEFL tool. It's set up to be like a tool to improve your writing. So take advantage of that. And I should mention it's free, and I think you can upload as many essays as you want. So that's a pretty cool tool to get feedback on your grammar. And last but not least, it's useful for most people to study grammar. One of the trends in TOEFL preparation I've noticed over like the past 5 years is that people don't want to study grammar. They think it's boring or tedious or not useful. They just don't like it. But I do feel that studying grammar is useful. So beyond using tools and beyond getting feedback, I always strongly recommend a nice book like English Grammar in Use. This one is the best-selling grammar book in the history of the universe. It's usually pretty easy to find, no matter what country you're in, and even in public libraries around the world. So I highly recommend it. Okay, so now we've talked about how to write a good TOEFL essay. I want to end the presentation by talking about some pitfalls, some common problems that students have. I'm going to show you a few more sample essays, and I'm going to talk about what matters and what doesn't in terms of the TOEFL essay. These days, I hear a lot of things. There's a lot of YouTube people. There's a lot of social media people. There's a lot of websites, and they say a lot of things, and students tend to believe it. So it's very common for students to come to me and tell me things. And I hear like, the essay needs to be 5 paragraphs. Like, it must be 5 paragraphs. If you write 4 paragraphs, that's a problem. I hear students say, the essay must have personal examples. They're mandatory. And then other students say, the essays must not have personal examples. They'll be like, that's a problem. You can't do it. I hear things like, you must not include the pronoun I. It must have sandwich paragraphs. It needs to have idioms. It must not be more than 300 words, or conversely, it must not be less than 600 words. It must have a concession paragraph. And when I gave this workshop yesterday, I even got a few more. Students heard that These essays must not have phrasal verbs. Another student said, the essay must be creative. That will help your score. So there's a lot of things I hear that just kind of come from, they come from the internet. Okay, so before I get into what you need and what you don't need, I want to show you a few sample essays. And these have all come from ETS sources. Like ETS makes the TOEFL, and they also have sample essays. The first one comes from the Official Guide to the TOEFL, a great book. This is a very standard essay, right? It starts with an introduction. It has some background sentences here, and then it has a thesis statement at the end. Then it has 2 body paragraphs, and then it has a conclusion. So it's basically what I taught, right? Now, one characteristic of this is that these body paragraphs have no personal examples, none. It's all just logical reading and logical reasoning and details and arguments. And this is described by ETS as a high-level essay. How nice. Here's another one. It's from the same book. Again, this is described by ETS as a high-level essay. Has an introduction. It has 2 nice background sentences. And then it has a very clear thesis. That is why I disagree with people who think that keeping old friends, blah, blah, blah. Very clear thesis with a signal. And then it has 3 body paragraphs. And the thing about these 3 body paragraphs is they heavily emphasize personal examples. I think the whole body is just a series of personal examples. There's 3 or 4 different ones. And that's totally fine. By the way, there is a conclusion, which begins with as a conclusion. So it's got a clear signal. Again, this is very similar to what I showed you guys just a little while ago. But the difference is that it's heavily on personal examples. And it's a high-level essay. Here's one more. This is from a manual that ETS uses to train teachers. And this one gets a score of 5, a perfect score. But this one's a little bit non-standard. It's got an introduction, and it's got a whole bunch of background sentences. And then it's got a body paragraph with a main idea. And down here, it's got another body paragraph with a main idea. And then in the middle, it's got a long personal example. And then it's got a conclusion. But the interesting thing is that the thesis statement is only mentioned in the conclusion. So it's got all the stuff that I mentioned earlier, but the ordering is a little bit different. This is certainly a non-standard essay. However, it still gets a score of 5. It's got everything an essay needs, but it's put together in a funny little way. Lastly, this one is hard to see, but you don't really need to read it, or you can pause the video and figure it out. This one has a long background section here. It's really long. And then the thesis statement here, it's basically in the middle of the essay. And then there's a couple body paragraphs, and there's a conclusion, which begins clearly with in summary. Again, that's a little bit non-standard, right? It's got all this background information that's kind of cut up into 3 different paragraphs. But, the thesis is easy to spot. I strongly agree with the view that blah, 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 the internet's useful. But it's just, it's in a weird place. However, this is described by ETS as a level 5 response. So despite being a little bit weird and a little bit non-standard in terms of structure, it's still a level 5 essay. It still has everything you need, right? It's got background information, it's got a thesis, it's got main ideas, it's got a conclusion. It's all there. So it gets a score of 5. Okay, so what? Why did I show you these sample essays? Well, I want to emphasize that as a student and a test taker, you have more freedom than you think. I want you to write an essay that plays to your strengths. I want you to include all the stuff I said, but in terms of the actual writing of the essay, write one that plays to your strengths. This will help you to get full credit for your knowledge and ability. Nothing breaks my heart more than when a student comes to me and I can tell immediately that they have fantastic English skills. And I can tell that they will excel at any university in the world. However, I look at their TOEFL score history and it's not good. And that's heartbreaking, right? I mean, they should be in the university immediately, and yet they're still struggling with the test. I want you to ensure that you aren't following rules from books or YouTube that end up hurting you more than helping you. Don't fall into these traps where you're writing bad essays because you're trying to follow all these rules and nonsense that you found online. There's a few things like that I get. I mean, I read maybe a dozen essays every day from students around the world. There's a few things I notice, more so now than in the past. I know that the student writes so much that their error rate increases. You know, I'll get students that are just like trying to write 800 words, and it's impossible. So they're just blasting through and making a ton of mistakes. I get essays where the student struggles to put their thoughts into a predetermined template or structure. So it's like, yeah, they saw some YouTube video which is like, this is the perfect template. This is the advanced template, and I got to use it, and that's going to be the secret to a high score. And in fact, it hurts them because, you know, their thoughts don't match the template they've been given. Also, the student feels obligated to use complicated grammar that further increases their error rate. Again, I know I told you to use like simple, complex, compound sentences, and that could be challenging, I admit. But I get essays where the student's just writing these really convoluted, complicated sentences with all these different grammatical structures and ideas, and it's just hurting them. They should not be doing that. I get essays where the student feels obligated to use idioms and does so poorly. I had an essay 2 days ago where the student's thesis said, this question takes two to tango, but I feel the internet is very useful in today's life. Again, and then through the rest of the essay, they had probably 4 more idioms. And it's clear that they were told that idioms would increase their score, but in fact, their usage would lower their score because it just wasn't working. There's no special bonus for using idioms like that, so you can probably just forget it. And I get essays, as I said, where the student struggles to come up with personal examples. You know, personal examples are not for everyone. Like, I get it. So if you are a person who struggles with personal examples, just forget it. And you can support your arguments using details, using logical reasoning, just using arguments. You can write a very argumentative essay. That's acceptable. So, you know, just to kind of get back to what the essay does need, what you do need, if you want some rules, here you go. You know, a good essay contains some background information that introduces the general theme, a clear thesis statement that responds to the question, 2 or 3 main ideas with plenty of supporting details, a short conclusion, various sentence types, and grammar and language use that is as correct as possible. That's about it, right? That's all you really need for a good essay. And, you know, as you write your practice essays, that's what you should try to include. Now, I will leave you with, some final advice. In order to improve your writing, you do need to write. You become a better writer by writing more. Whether you're a native speaker or whether you're someone who's learning English, you want to get better, you have to produce writing. Just remember the proper cycle for your practice. You need to produce writing, and then you need to get feedback. And then you use that feedback to produce more writing, and you get more feedback. Repeat, repeat, repeat. You know, using this cycle You could write 5 essays. You could write 10 essays. You could write 20 essays. You could write 100 essays. Just keep that in mind. Now, I know it's not easy for everyone to get feedback from an actual human tutor, which is why I did recommend some of those tools like Grammarly and Edigree that can provide automated feedback for free. And there's more online. If you have any favorites, share them with me and I'll put them in the next version of this presentation. To paraphrase a really great football coach, remember that practice does not make perfect. Proper practice makes perfect. Ensure that you're not simply writing a million essays. Ensure that you're writing essays and learning about your mistakes and what you've done right and what you've done wrong, and then include that information, in your next essay, and then just repeat that process. That brings us to the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment if you're seeing this in YouTube, or you can always feel free to email me at any one of those 2 addresses, and I'll try to answer you as soon as I can. All right, I will leave it at that, but as I said, I'm going to try to get a video about the integrated essay online in the next week or 2, so keep an eye out for that.